2 centimeters, exactly the distance the Earth's crust beneath Iceland shifts every year. This slow, silent tectonic movement has resulted in the formation of more than 130 active volcanic systems and kilometer-long fissures across the island. Why do these massive geological fractures pose such a catastrophic threat to modern settlements? It only looks obvious that the distance is small, but in reality, the constant tension releases molten lava reaching temperatures of over 1,100 degrees Celsius. This incandescent mass possesses enough volume and heat to cover and completely destroy an entire town within just a few hours. Facing such immense geological power is a challenge where humans cannot extinguish an erupting volcano. Engineers and emergency teams can only construct massive lava barriers to slow down a natural process that cannot be fully stopped. One can notice how heavy machinery moves tons of earth and basalt to redirect the flow of the glowing liquid. But this is just the beginning. The process of containment is only gaining momentum as the molten stream pushes against the artificial embankments with millions of tons of pressure. The equipment gradually shapes these earthen walls into defensive perimeters that stretch for kilometers across the barren landscape. It is visible how the cooling outer crust of the lava interacts with the soil of the barriers, creating a temporary dam against the heat. Everything only gets more complicated as the eruption continues to feed the flow from deep within the crust. At first glance, these engineering efforts seem like a permanent solution, but in reality, they represent a desperate attempt to manage an unstoppable force. The primary question remains whether humans can truly halt the advance of the melt, or if these structures are merely buying time before nature eventually prevails. Transition to the next level of defense requires constant monitoring of the flow rate and thermal intensity. Automated sensors and drones track the movement of the burning front as it approaches critical infrastructure. It does not end at this stage. The barriers must be reinforced ceaselessly as the lava level rises higher against the slopes. The molten material continues its journey toward the sea, leaving behind a transformed landscape that no human intervention can revert to its original state. Thus, the struggle against the volcanic flow reaches a point where engineering meets its physical limit. This phase of the containment effort concludes, opening the road to long-term observation of the changing terrain. 1,300 years of volcanic history define the reality of Iceland, a territory that serves as one of the most geologically active hotspots on our planet. Why does this island of ice remain in a state of constant thermal upheaval? It might seem like a frozen wasteland at first glance, but in reality, the nation sits directly atop the jagged boundary where two massive tectonic plates are continuously pulling away from one another. This deep geological rift allows magma to rise from the Earth's mantle, frequently breaking through the crust to trigger intense eruptions. The movement of the crust never stops. One can notice how molten rock usually follows predictable paths through uninhabited fields of black basaltic rock. But this is just the beginning. When the direction of the molten flow shifts toward populated settlements, the natural phenomenon transforms into an immediate and serious threat to infrastructure. On average, the island records approximately 4 volcanic eruptions every single year, yet no mathematical model can accurately predict the exact coordinates where the next fissure will open. The process is only gaining momentum as seismic activity fluctuates. It only looks obvious that the land is stable, but in reality, the subsurface is a fluid system of pressure and heat. When the eruption that commenced in 2023 eventually covered an area of 15 square kilometers, Icelandic authorities were forced to respond with immediate technical intervention. A large-scale engineering operation was launched across the affected zones. Engineers initiated the construction of massive lava barriers, which are essentially enormous earthen walls designed with a single critical objective. These structures serve to slow the advancing front of the lava flow as it moves across the terrain. The equipment gradually maneuvers tons of soil and rock to form these defensive perimeters against the heat. One can notice how the heavy machinery operates at a steady pace to reinforce the height of the embankments before the molten material reaches the outskirts of human habitations. The process of defensive construction continues until the threat to the nearby towns is effectively mitigated. Transition to the next level of civil protection occurs as the barriers reach their planned height of several meters. From here, the transformation of the landscape moves to the next phase of disaster management as the lava is redirected by the physical mass of the walls. 20 meters is the height the protective wall eventually reached at the absolute peak of the emergency operation. Why are these lava barriers not built as finished structures from the very first day? It only looks obvious that a wall should be static, but in reality, the barrier is the result of a continuous and frantic construction process that evolves alongside the movement of the molten rock. Without this constant adaptation, the shifting flow would simply bypass or overwhelm any fixed defense, rendering the entire effort useless. Heavy machinery works without pause to pile material against the advancing heat. One can notice how the equipment gradually shapes the earth into a massive bulwark. This process is only gaining momentum. Behind this towering wall of earth and stone stands a critical geothermal power plant, a facility responsible for supplying hot water and electrical energy to a large portion of the population of Iceland. If the lava flow were to reach this specific site, the consequences would extend far beyond the localized destruction of a single industrial area. The entire daily infrastructure, which currently serves tens of thousands of people, could be completely paralyzed or destroyed. At first glance, the wall seems like a simple heap of dirt, but in reality, it is the only thing standing between a natural disaster and a nationwide energy crisis. 3 million cubic meters of material were moved over the course of 6 months to form this defensive line. This massive volume consisted primarily of volcanic rock and local soil, hauled by a fleet of trucks and dozers. It gets more complex further on. The lava did not stop despite the presence of the massive earthen barrier. When the molten rock eventually overflowed the top of the wall at several different locations, the situation required immediate intervention. Firefighting crews were forced to spray thousands of liters of water directly onto the red-hot lava to cool the surface and slow its forward advance. One can notice how the water turns instantly into thick clouds of white steam upon contact with the heat. This action serves a specific technical purpose, as it buys additional time for the construction teams to reinforce the height and thickness of the barrier. The cooling crust provides a temporary anchor for new layers of soil and rock. Everything only gets more complicated as the heat remains trapped beneath the surface. From here, the defense continues to grow as the cooling material is integrated into the foundation of the reinforced wall. Thus, the transformation of the landscape moves into a new phase of preservation and engineering. 1 meter, that is the precise height of each individual layer added to these massive earthen embankments. Why are lava barriers constructed with such a relatively simple internal structure compared to the complex reinforcement of hydraulic dams? It only looks obvious that a wall of rock should suffice, but a concrete dam must withstand the constant hydrostatic pressure and seepage of liquid water. Lava behaves according to entirely different physical laws due to its extreme viscosity and internal friction, allowing engineers to bypass the need for deep, waterproof foundations. Engineers build these structures layer by layer, utilizing the very terrain they seek to protect. The equipment gradually deposits tons of volcanic soil and crushed rock to form a barrier that functions as a physical redirection tool rather than a sealed container. But this is just the beginning. One can notice how the heavy machinery compacts the earth to ensure that the weight of the encroaching molten flow does not immediately collapse the slope. Lava does not permeate the soil or find microscopic paths through the embankment like water does. Instead, the molten material moves as a thick, incandescent mass that is dictated almost entirely by the angle of the slope and the cooling of its own outer crust. At first glance, the task of stopping such a force seems impossible, but in reality, the high temperature of the melt makes it more susceptible to changes in elevation. The process is only gaining momentum as the flow approaches the newly formed ridge. The primary objective of the construction team is to maintain a height advantage over the advancing front of the eruption. One can notice how the barrier rises steadily, with bulldozers and excavators moving back and forth to add another meter of elevation whenever the lava threatens to overtop the crest. It is visible how the molten flow begins to thicken and slow down as it loses its original momentum against the physical bulk of the earth. Because the liquid rock is so dense, the barrier merely needs to force a change in the direction of the flow toward a less critical area. Therefore, the work continues around the clock as long as the volcanic activity remains high. If the level of the melt rises, the wall is raised further, 1 meter at a time, until the lava naturally cools, loses its fluidity, or shifts its trajectory toward an uninhabited path. The material remains in place, forming a new permanent feature of the landscape. 375 Komatsu units, Liebherr 776 models, and Caterpillar D11 bulldozers operate simultaneously across the volcanic landscape. Why was it necessary for Iceland to mobilize such a heavy, earth-moving fleet, rarely seen assembled at a single construction site in the history of the region? A massive concentration of machinery was required to reach a specific defensive speed. But without this coordinated mechanical force, the construction of the barriers would lag behind the natural flow of the eruption. The scale of this equipment was not intended to showcase industrial size or engineering dominance. It gets more complex further on. One can notice how the heavy blades of the bulldozers push thousands of tons of basaltic soil into high ridges, while the equipment gradually forms a perimeter. At first glance, the assembly of so many machines looks like a display of power, but in reality, it reflects a harsh and urgent physical reality. Every hour that passes in the work zone allows the lava to advance further toward the inhabited areas. Only by moving material at maximum speed could the wall stand a chance of staying ahead of the creeping molten rock. Articulated dump trucks move in a ceaseless loop to deliver volcanic slag to the crest of the embankments. The process is only gaining momentum as the height of the barriers increases to meet the predicted volume of the flow. The camera glides along the line of yellow and white steel, where hundreds of thousands of pounds of pressure are applied to the earth every second. These machines work in a synchronized rhythm to ensure the structural integrity of the cooling mounds. It is visible how the metal tracks of the Caterpillar D11 units grind into the hardened surface to provide the necessary traction for shifting massive volumes of debris. Therefore, the mechanical fleet must maintain a 24-hour operational cycle without interruption. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase as the defensive line solidifies against the heat. 100% of the barrier construction begins directly atop the scorched foundation of lava that has cooled and solidified following previous volcanic eruptions. Why is this specific geological placement chosen for the new defensive structure? At first glance, the terrain appears to be nothing more than a jagged wasteland, but in reality, this previous destruction provides the most stable footing available. The molten flow cools into thick, heavy basalt rock that possesses an extremely high density, making it a material that is exceptionally difficult to fracture or displace. Heavy bulldozers equipped with reinforced ripper teeth move across the uneven surface to fracture this basalt. One can notice how the operator concentrates the full weight of the massive machine onto individual contact points to crush the stubborn material into manageable fragments. The metal teeth sink into the stone with the immense pressure of hydraulics, splitting the dark rock into smaller pieces. But this is just the beginning. Bulldozers push the broken rock into large, organized piles using their wide blades. The process is only gaining momentum as the mechanical blades scrape across the stone with a rhythmic grinding sound. Hydraulic excavators then lift the basalt and load it onto heavy-duty trucks for transport. The camera glides along the constant line of vehicles as they move the material continuously to the active wall construction site. It is visible how the old lava is dumped in precise volumes and compacted layer by layer to ensure structural integrity. Each individual meter of height is calculated in advance by engineers to withstand the thermal and physical pressure of future flows. At this specific location, the very substance that once destroyed infrastructure is repurposed as the primary material for the defensive barrier. This technical transformation forces new lava flows to lose their kinetic energy, slowing down their advance and compelling them to change direction away from populated areas. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste. 1,000 degrees or higher is the temperature at which molten rock moves with a slow but relentless weight across the Icelandic landscape. Why do the inhabitants of this island remain calm as incandescent flows approach their infrastructure? At first glance, the advance of the material seems like a force that could be managed with enough engineering, but in reality, the population understands that this geological process follows no strategy beyond the laws of gravity. But this is just the beginning. The lava only looks like a chaotic liquid, yet it consistently seeks out the lowest points of the terrain to fill the topography with millions of tons of basaltic weight. One can notice how the dark crust cracks as the pressure from the interior forces the flow forward across roads and power grids. The equipment of modern civilization, from high-voltage lines to residential foundations, is systematically destroyed as the mineral mass advances. The process is only gaining momentum. Entire towns are sometimes abandoned as the molten rock moves through, turning habitable zones into permanent fields of volcanic glass. Because human technology has definitive limits against such thermal energy, the society has transitioned to a strategy of calculated adaptation rather than futile resistance. At certain moments, one can notice residents using the radiating heat from the cooling edges of the flow to cook food. It is visible how this act serves as a technical gesture of familiarity rather than a display of recklessness. This everyday interaction reflects a deep-seated understanding of a land where volcanic activity is a constant physical reality. It gets more complex further on. The focus of the engineers and the public shifts toward the construction of massive earthen barriers designed to redirect the fluid. These structures are not intended for absolute control, but to provide a specific window of time to protect critical assets. The calmness of the society stems from the precise knowledge of how long these barriers will hold against the pressure. Everything only gets more complicated as new fissures open, yet the population continues to prioritize the protection of life and essential infrastructure within the constraints dictated by the Earth. Molten rock eventually settles and hardens into a new layer of the crust, and the cycle of the landscape concludes this phase. 600 pounds is the weight of the aerial bombs once deployed to disrupt the flow of molten rock. Why would military aircraft be tasked with such an extreme tactical intervention against a geological event? It would seem that standard barriers would suffice to redirect the liquid stone. But in reality, when the advancing front is only a few dozen hours away from critical infrastructure, the time required to mobilize heavy machinery for earthen wall construction makes such defenses nearly impossible to execute. At first glance, an earthen barrier appears to be a solid solution, but the 2024 eruption of Reiki and Easy demonstrated the fragility of this approach. One can notice how lava successfully bypassed these obstacles by surging through newly formed fissures that bypassed the walls entirely. The camera glides along the paved road surfaces where sections of the barriers were simply pushed aside. Because of the low friction between the pavement and the defensive mounds, the immense weight of the melt allowed it to slide through with minimal resistance. This is just the beginning. Military aircraft in 1935 and 1942 dropped explosives directly into the lava tubes of Mauna Loa. The objective was not to extinguish the volcanic activity, but to destroy the internal structure of the tubes. This forced the molten rock to spill out at the site of the blast, instead of following its subterranean path further downslope. Everything only gets more complicated as the results are analyzed. The method did not produce consistent technical outcomes. Some attempts managed to slow the advance for a short duration, while others were completely ineffective against the volume of the discharge. Despite the inherent risks and the high degree of uncertainty, attempting this intervention was considered a better alternative than passive observation. The process of active defense against volcanic flows remains a complex challenge for engineering and logistics. In desperate situations, the transition to the next level of intervention becomes a necessity. The molten material eventually settles, and the immediate threat to the perimeter subsides. Thus ends one of the most unpredictable stages of geological disaster management. 1973 marks the year of the historic Heimaey eruption on the Icelandic island of Heimaey, where the advance of molten rock threatened the vital harbor of Eldfell. Why did engineers decide to use massive quantities of water against a liquid stone flow? At first glance, fighting a volcanic eruption with pumps seems like a futile effort, but in reality, this tactical intervention proved that the thermal energy of lava can be manipulated. The cooling process creates a physical obstruction that dictates the path of the remaining melt. Seawater was sprayed directly onto the advancing lava flow in a continuous high-pressure stream. One can notice how the liquid hits the glowing surface, immediately turning into thick clouds of white steam as the temperature of the rock begins to drop. This is just the beginning. The equipment gradually saturates the moving front, causing the molten mass to lose its fluidity and transform into a blackened solid crust. The process is only gaining momentum as the artificial cooling deepens the outer layer of the flow. This hardened shell serves as a natural barrier, exerting physical pressure on the liquid magma still pushing from behind. It is visible how the internal pressure of the flow is forced to find a different path, effectively redirecting the destructive energy away from the harbor's infrastructure. Under the right conditions, such as those found in Iceland, humans can successfully slow and divert the movement of geological forces. It must be noted that this method is not designed to extinguish the volcanic source itself, which remains active deep underground. Instead, the intervention focuses on the protection of critical transport hubs and residential zones. Everything only gets more complicated as the volume of water required grows, yet the success at Eldfell remains a primary reference for disaster mitigation. Therefore, the technique serves as a method to buy additional time for evacuation and the reinforcement of secondary defenses. The camera glides along the massive pumps that redirected the flow, showing how human engineering can influence even the most violent natural phenomena. The cooling operation concludes by leaving behind a stabilized wall of basalt, ensuring the harbor remains functional for future use. This intervention demonstrates that strategic cooling can mitigate the impact of an eruption without stopping the geological event entirely. Molten rock eventually ceases its forward motion, settling into a new permanent landscape. 800 meters above sea level is the maximum elevation where volcanic slopes provide the rare natural conditions necessary for viticulture. Why do humans return to land once scorched by molten rock? It would seem that earthen barriers and explosives are merely temporary measures to buy time against an eruption. But in reality, once the lava cools, it transforms into a mineral-rich foundation containing high concentrations of potassium, magnesium, and iron. These specific elements are essential for the complex development of grapevines. But this is just the beginning. The soil structure is naturally porous. It only looks obvious that water would pool on the surface, but in reality, the liquid drains away with high speed. This physical characteristic forces the vine roots to descend dozens of centimeters deep into the earth in a persistent search for moisture. One can notice how this struggle creates stronger and more resilient plants capable of surviving harsh environments. Most of these vineyards are oriented toward the southwest to maximize specific environmental factors. The process is only gaining momentum. During the daylight hours, the plants receive a calculated amount of sunlight to drive the internal engine of photosynthesis. As evening falls, the significant temperature difference between day and night effectively slows the ripening process. This thermal shift allows the sugars and complex flavors to accumulate in a precise balance within each berry. Over time, the once barren hills are systematically covered with lush green layers of vineyards. Each year, local growers harvest thousands of tons of high-quality grapes from these reclaimed zones. It gets more complex further on. New vines are introduced into the volcanic soil with technical precision. Each individual plant is placed into a hole exactly 40 centimeters deep. The workers mix the local earth with organic compost and volcanic ash to create a nutrient-dense substrate. This mixture ensures the roots anchor quickly while absorbing the mineral legacy of previous eruptions. The climate here is consistently dry and windy. One can notice how these conditions favor the development of thin-skinned grape varieties. Thin skins allow the fruit to absorb sunlight at a moderate, controlled level. This also prevents the accumulation of excess moisture, which is the primary factor leading to viticultural diseases. After approximately 3 years of careful cultivation and monitoring, the vines finally produce their inaugural harvest. Harvesting operations typically commence in the early morning hours. At first glance, the timing seems arbitrary, but in reality the cool air and light mist are critical. Mist covers the grape clusters like a protective shroud to preserve natural moisture levels. This thermal management reduces the rate of oxidation before the raw material reaches the processing facility. After the season concludes, tons of ripe grapes are extracted from the hillsides layered in ash. Depending on the specific vintage and weather patterns, each hectare yields between 8 and 12 tons of fruit. This is a significant output for territory once classified as impossible to cultivate. The process is only gaining momentum. Highest quality clusters are transported to the winery on the same day to lock in freshness and sugar content. Upon arrival, the grapes are thoroughly washed to remove every trace of dust and volcanic residue. Automated systems then perform de-stemming before feeding the fruit into a sealed pressing mechanism. The pressure is strictly controlled to extract clear juice without releasing harsh, astringent compounds from the seeds or skins. Everything only gets more complicated as the chemistry begins to change. Juice is transferred into massive fermentation tanks, where natural yeast begins the conversion of sugars into alcohol. This stage develops the specific flavors characteristic of the volcanic terroir. After the primary fermentation is complete, the liquid moves into oak barrels for a period of several months. The wood helps stabilize the molecular structure and builds a necessary depth of flavor. Once the technicians determine the wine has reached its desired maturity, it is bottled and moved to cool cellars. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste. 1,200 degrees Celsius is the approximate temperature at which molten basalt begins its slow and relentless advance across the landscape. Why do humans persist in attempting to halt a force that seems entirely unstoppable? It would appear that a liquid rock stream would simply bypass any obstacle in its path. But by constructing massive earthen walls and reinforced rock embankments, engineers create a physical delay that allows for the evacuation of populations and the protection of critical infrastructure. At first glance, these barriers are a sign of strength, but in reality, they represent the tactical recognition that human technology can only redirect natural forces rather than exert absolute control over them. One can notice how the heavy machinery moves with precision to stack thousands of tons of basalt into artificial ridges. This process is not intended to defeat the volcano, but rather to buy precious hours or days. But this is just the beginning. When passive barriers prove insufficient to protect a settlement, the strategy shifts toward more aggressive interventions. Engineers have historically turned to extreme measures, such as the strategic bombing of active lava tubes to disrupt the internal flow of the melt. These risky efforts reveal a fundamental desire to intervene in geological processes that exist far beyond the standard scale of human influence. It gets more complex further on. The camera glides along the blackened crust, where the liquid fire finally comes to a standstill and the cooling process begins. Dust slowly settles over the jagged formations as the heat dissipates into the atmosphere over several months. This stage marks a transition from immediate survival to a long-term geological transformation. Lava only looks obvious as a source of total devastation. In reality, the most profound technical and biological meaning of the flow emerges only after the basalt has completely solidified. The mineral-rich ground that remains becomes the primary foundation for a new ecological cycle. It does not end at this stage. Grapevines take root in the weathered cracks of the volcanic rock, drawing nutrients from the decomposed minerals to thrive in environments that were previously scorched. The process is only gaining momentum. This shift represents a transition from resisting the environment to actively utilizing its unique chemical properties for agriculture. From this same deep basaltic layer, geothermal water filters through the porous stone and eventually forms the complex Blue Lagoon ecosystem. One can notice how the mineral-rich water creates a unique environment that serves as both a healing natural resource and a primary economic symbol. The equipment gradually harnesses the thermal energy trapped beneath the surface to provide power and heat to the surrounding region. Everything only gets more complicated when considering the sheer scale of the adaptation required to live in these zones. Humans do not attempt to conquer the volcanic landscape through absolute force, but through a combination of patience and technical flexibility. It is visible how the hazard is systematically converted into a functional opportunity for the nation. The molten stream goes further along the production chain of nature, leaving behind a reinforced foundation for future growth. Thus, the steel-hard basalt reaches a state where it no longer threatens, but instead supports the life that returns to its surface. From barriers and explosives to the cultivation of lush vineyards, the cycle of adaptation is completed without haste. 100% effectiveness is not the goal when constructing lava barriers, yet these structures provide humans with critical additional time. Why are these earthen walls built if they cannot completely halt the molten flow? At first glance, the task seems impossible, but in reality, the barriers are strategically engineered to redirect the advancing mass. This delay allows for the protection of infrastructure, energy grids, and human lives that would otherwise be lost. But this is just the beginning. The equipment gradually moves massive volumes of earth to form these defensive perimeters. One can notice how the heavy machinery operates with urgent precision against the rising heat. In this confrontation between engineering and geology, perfect solutions do not exist. Decisions are made within seconds because every tactical error carries an immense physical and economic cost. It gets more complex further on. When the lava finally cools and the movement of the Earth ceases, life does not simply revert to its previous state. It returns in a different form, characterized by a heightened awareness of geological limits and a superior adaptation to the volatile landscape. The process is only gaining momentum as communities rebuild with new technical insights. After every volcanic flow, what remains on the ground is not merely solidified basaltic rock, but a collection of engineering lessons regarding human coexistence with the natural world. One can notice the physical change in the terrain where the barriers stood. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase of human history without haste. Thus ends one of the key stages of understanding how technology interfaces with the planet's most extreme forces.